Hey kids, how you doing? Hey, as we get started here on our chapter for the Great Depression, we come from a period of the 1920s, which by and large, certainly not for everybody necessarily, but by and large was a time of prosperity. It was pretty good times for people. Everyone kind of thought, that times were getting better. There were plenty of jobs. People had some extra money. And people figured that, it was just going to get better and better and better. And that, we've had other times like that in the past. And of course, it never goes that way. There's always peaks and valleys in the way that America goes and its economy and all that kind of thing. And eventually the bubble did burst, and we saw a period, after 10 years of the 1920s, where generally people were pretty prosperous. Just about everybody had a job. We entered the 1930s in a period of time known as the Great Depression, where people underwent untold suffering like we really hadn't seen in a long, long time, and maybe never in American history. And that led to a really fundamental change in the way that Americans viewed their government and viewed the role of government in the United States. And that's going to be kind of what we're going to be reading about here today with the, like I said, the bubble bursting, with the stock market crash, why that happened, the things that caused that to lead to people losing their jobs and everything like that. And then the government response or lack of response, followed by the election in 1932 of Franklin Roosevelt. And basically he was elected on a promise to, hey, we're going to do everything that we need to do in order to help people out. And we're going to do things that government has never done before. And that was what he ran on. That's what he did when he was put into office in beginning of 1933, where he ended up creating a program called the New Deal, which was a series of government programs all designed to help lift us out of the Great Depression, make people's lives better, help us recover and get out of the Depression, and then to kind of set things up so that we never had to deal with something like that again. So let's take a look at our first article, which is called Into the Abyss, and please follow along while I read. The Great Depression, Into the Abyss, Hoover and the Crash. In 1928, Republican Herbert Hoover was elected president. Hoover ran on and won on a platform of continuing President Calvin Coolidge's economic deregulation policies, which were largely credited with the economic boom of the 1920s. Hoover won easily. However, the economy was not as strong as it appeared. While the stock market continued to rise, many older industries such as coal mining and clothing manufacture were in decline. More and more, the market lost touch with reality. In essence, people were paying more and more for stocks because they got used to doing so. It no longer mattered whether it made economic sense to pay more. People just did, assuming that they would be able to sell them later for an even higher profit. People were able to pay ever higher prices due to a practice called margin buying. Basically, people could purchase stocks by paying only a fraction of the cost at the outset and then owing the rest. They could pay off the rest of what was owed once they sold the stock. Now, this process worked just fine as long as one could always count on selling the stock for more than one paid. Starting in the fall of 1929, prices began to slide. Economists and politicians said it was a momentary correction and the march upward would begin again. On Monday, October 23rd, the market lost $4 billion. Brokers who had lent people money to buy on margin began to call in their loans. This led prices to fall further. Then on October 29th, 1929, a day that would become known as Black Tuesday, the bottom fell out completely. The stock market lost almost all the value that had been built up over the previous 10 years. Millionaires lost fortunes overnight. The stock market crash marked the beginning of a 12-year economic and social disaster known as the Great Depression. The Depression begins. One major cause of the Great Depression was overproduction. Factories continued to produce more than people were willing to buy. For example, millions of people purchased their first automobile during the 1920s, but almost all families in those days needed only one car. The auto industry continued to build them as if everyone would come back for a new one each year. A nationwide banking crisis also contributed to the Depression. In those days, savings deposits were not insured. If the bank that held money went out of business, those savings were lost. The banks were heavily invested in the stock market, so when it crashed, those funds were gone. With banks going out of business, many other businesses that lost money in those bank failures lost their funds as well. Without money, businesses could not pay employees. Businesses laid off employees or were forced into bankruptcy. In this way, millions of Americans who were not personally invested in the stock market lost their savings and their jobs due to the stock market crash. Most of the world's economies, then as well as today, are linked. Soon, the Depression, which began in the USA, spread worldwide. Brother, can you spare a dime? Between 1929 and 1933, the unemployment rate skyrocketed from 3% to 25%. In some areas, the jobless rate was much, much higher. For example, in Toledo, Ohio, 4 out of 5 workers could find no work. Even then, those who held on to jobs saw their hours cut back and their salaries slashed. But being underemployed was better than being unemployed, so people did the best they could. Grinding poverty crushed American spirits. In those days, there was no unemployment insurance. There was no welfare. If you were on hard times, you were on your own. Perhaps family, churches, or charities could help out, but for most, that was a last resort and often not enough anyway. Jobless people lined up at soup kitchens to avoid starvation. On the outskirts of big cities or in public parks, homeless people built communities of shacks they cynically called Hoovervilles after the president who they believed had abandoned them. The Depression often had a harsh effect on American families. Many broke up as fathers left to find work wherever they could. Other families disintegrated due to the stress of poverty. President Hoover saw the damage done by the Depression and did try to help. However, in those days, the federal government simply did not take the lead in helping private citizens through tough times. Hoover tried to convince local leaders to do so. The results were mixed at best, though, and many Americans blamed Hoover for the crisis. In 1932, thousands of World War I veterans went to Washington, D.C. When they left the service in 1919, the government promised that they would receive a $1,000 bonus in 1945. Desperate veterans wanted those bonuses to be paid immediately. Hoover and Congress listened and then told the veterans, who were now being referred to as the Bonus Army, that they would receive their money in 1945 as promised, but not now. Of the 20,000 original members of the Bonus Army, about 2,000 veterans, having nowhere else to go, stayed in the Hooverville they built in Washington, D.C. Hoover used government forces to violently disperse the Bonus Army. Many Americans were outraged by the use of deadly force against unarmed men who had served their country in wartime. Roosevelt and the New Deal. After 3 years of the Great Depression, President Hoover was deeply unpopular. As the 1932 presidential election approached, the American people were clearly ready for a change. President Hoover ran on the idea that happier times were ahead if everyone just stuck together and continued to believe. Meanwhile, his opponent was a Democrat from New York named Franklin Delano Roosevelt, or FDR as he became known. Roosevelt was a relative of former President Theodore Roosevelt and had been stricken with the disease polio in 1920. For the rest of his life, Roosevelt was unable to walk unaided. He refused to be photographed in a wheelchair, and in those days before TV, most Americans never knew his legs were paralyzed. As he began to run for the presidency, he promised a New Deal for the American people. The term New Deal would eventually come to describe Roosevelt's entire political program. Unlike Hoover's response, which seemed to involve a lot of wishful thinking and a certain line of government intervention that Hoover would not cross, Roosevelt promised that under him, the U.S. government would try to do something, anything to reverse the Depression. And he intended to start helping immediately. Roosevelt won the 1932 election in a landslide. The day after Roosevelt took office, he instituted a banking holiday to halt the epidemic of banking failures. People were never sure which banks were safe to use and which were not, so people increasingly refused to use any banks. With the money stuffed into people's mattresses instead of circulating in the economy, the chances of pulling out of the Depression were slim. So Roosevelt ordered all banks closed for a period of 4 days. Only those banks that were strong enough to stay in business were allowed to reopen. In this way, the American people were reassured that the banks still in operation were safe in which to deposit money. Roosevelt also used the power of mass media to get his message out. While TV did not yet exist, radio had already become essential in most American households. Roosevelt regularly went on the radio to speak directly to Americans in what were called fireside chats. In those days, believe it or not, most Americans had no idea what the president's voice sounded like. Other presidents had been on the radio before, but none had embraced the new medium like Roosevelt. Relief, recovery, and reform. Roosevelt, the new Democratic-nominated Congress, passed a flurry of legislation. 15 new bills were signed into law in the administration's first 100 days. Ever since then, the 100 days is used as a measuring stick for presidential achievement. A president will never be more powerful than he is in his administration's first 100 days. So the best chance to effect real political change is immediately. FDR did it better than any president in American history. Those 15 new laws were the beginning of the New Deal. The New Deal had 3 goals. They promised relief for the jobless, economic recovery, and reform to prevent another Great Depression from happening again. 2 early New Deal programs were the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC, and the Works Progress Administration, the WPA. Those programs provided relief by providing jobs to those out of work. The CCC put men to work building infrastructure in America's national parks, such as Starved Rock State Park in Utica, Illinois. The WPA, meanwhile, built public roads, schools, stadiums, and government offices all over the country. In the 21st century, while most of these buildings have been replaced, some are still in use. For decades, these buildings provided the framework for American towns and cities all over the country. Other New Deal programs were instituted to promote economic recovery. The National Recovery Administration, the NRA, aimed to keep prices stable. The Public Works Administration, the PWA, granted more than $3 billion for large public works projects such as dams, highways, and tunnels. The Tennessee Valley Authority, the TVA, built dams to control flooding and provide cheap hydroelectric power to rural areas. The most important New Deal program to reform the economy was the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC, in 1933. This program, which still exists today, worked along with the banking holiday. It restored American confidence in the banking system, which is the backbone of the American economy. The FDIC protected bank deposits by insuring them up to $2,500. It is now $100,000. Even today, if a bank fails, as so many did during the Depression, people can get their money back from the government. Meanwhile, Roosevelt was meeting increasing resistance to the New Deal from a largely conservative Supreme Court. When the Supreme Court ruled the NRA unconstitutional, Roosevelt responded by appointing several new Supreme Court justices to raise the number of justices from 9 to 15. All of who happened to be sympathetic to the New Deal. Roosevelt's own Democratic Party dominated Congress, but those congressmen recognized Roosevelt's court packing plan was an abuse of power and infringed upon the separation of powers outlined in the Constitution. In 1936, Congress struck down the court packing plan. So, several things, regarding the New Deal, and we see a lot of this stuff is still right at the center of debate over what is the proper role of government in the United States. How much should it help people? How much should it not try to help people? And you got a fundamental difference in how the two parties in America view that, and it's pretty much the same as it was back in the 1930s, where the Democrats argue for more government intervention and the Republicans argue for less. So that's kind of where we'll leave it off right here. We'll come back and we'll take a look at the later Depression in our next article. So looking forward to seeing you then. Take it easy.